In the cold, damp streets of medieval London, long before lanterns lit the alleys and laws protected the vulnerable, there were voices that history nearly forgot. Women whose lives were lived on the edges of cobbled stones and whispered rumors. They were called harlots, but their true stories were far more complex than the word suggests. Some were poor daughters abandoned by famine. Some were widows with no other path. And some were simply women who didn't fit the mold society expected. Their names didn't make it into the great books of kings and conquerors, but they were there, living behind the city walls, surviving in shadows. The fog hung low the morning that Johanna was forced from her home. She was 17. Her father had died of fever during a wet winter, and her mother had vanished during a wheat riot that left the village in ash. With no family, no land, and nothing to sell but her own hands and body, she followed the muddy trail south to London. She wasn't the first girl to make that journey with hope tangled into her hair, and she wouldn't be the last. London was supposed to be a place where you could find work in kitchens, markets, or taverns, but even those doors closed quickly when you came in barefoot and hungry. A tavern keeper named Master Elric gave her a corner to sleep in after she scrubbed floors for nearly 2 days straight. But kindness in those times often came with expectations. It wasn't long before she was told she could stay only if she entertained his customers. No one used the word harlot to her face. They just handed her a pitcher of ale and told her to smile. The men didn't ask if she had a choice, and the coin they left behind went straight into Elric's hand. In public, people called her wench, sometimes filth, but in private, behind heavy doors and thick curtains, they spoke softer. They told her their secrets, cried over their wives, asked her to pretend. What the world didn't see was that women like Johanna weren't only selling their bodies. They were absorbing the pain of an entire city. In the candlelit spaces of inns and brothels, they heard more about politics and war than most scribes. They knew when the market would rise and fall before the town crier shouted it. They heard names of merchants who paid off guards, of noblemen who lost everything in gambling, and of priests who confessed to far worse than sin. Their ears were never empty, and their minds never still. By the time Johanna was 20, she no longer served ale. She wore fine dresses, borrowed, not owned, and lived in the upper floor of a house on Candlewick Street, a place run by a sharp woman named Agnes. Agnes had been in the trade for decades, though she never said how long. Her rules were strict. No street work, no drunkenness, no men without coin, and no trust for anyone, not even each other. Agnes protected her girls fiercely, but her protection came at a cost. She demanded silence, loyalty, and a cut of everything. The women in her house walked a narrow line. They were safer than those on the streets, but one wrong move, one angry noble, and it could all be taken away. Outside, the city roared. Disease spread through the air like gossip. Filth flooded the alleyways. Men wore daggers like belts. There were no police, no safe houses. If something happened to you, it stayed happened. That's why the women formed quiet alliances. They learned how to slip notes between each other, how to signal danger with just a look. Some even carried blades beneath their skirts, hidden near their garters. And when one girl went missing, because sometimes they did, they lit a candle for her and never spoke her name again. It was a rule. You could mourn her, but only in silence. Not all harlots were treated equally. The city had layers like rotten onions. The ones in silk who served knights and bishops were called courtesans, and sometimes they were even invited to feasts. The ones in the streets, near the Thames, were not so lucky. They froze in winter, starved in summer, and their bruises didn't fade before new ones came. There was a girl named Marjorie who once sang in the choir at church. She was found one night beneath London Bridge, her voice stolen forever. The others didn't cry. They just tightened their cloaks and walked faster. Despite the cruelty, some women found strange fragments of power. A harlot could ruin a man if she whispered the right secret to the right ear. Some worked their way into favor with merchants or minor lords. They learned how to read ledgers, bribe guards, and even invest in grain futures, skills most women were forbidden to learn. But knowledge was dangerous. For every woman who climbed too high, there was always someone waiting to knock her down. Gossip was sharp, and jealousy sharper. Johanna kept her eyes low and her ears open. She knew how fast fortunes changed. She'd seen Agnes slap a girl for less than a lie and toss her into the alley without shoes. She'd also seen Agnes weep once over a letter burned in the hearth. No one asked why. They simply pretended not to notice. That was the way of survival. Pretend, perform, endure. The women knew how to play roles better than any actor on a stage. The world only saw what they allowed it to see. Years passed. Johanna learned to walk with grace and speak with calculated sweetness. Men began to ask for her by name. They paid double just to sit beside her, to hear her opinions on the royal court, or the French wars, or the rising price of wool. She didn't just sell her body anymore. She sold comfort, attention, mystery. But there was one client who unsettled her, a quiet man with a scar on his jaw and ink-stained fingers. He didn't speak much. He never touched her. He simply asked questions about the city, about Agnes, about who came and went. And then he vanished. It wasn't until weeks later that Johanna saw his face again, this time on a wanted poster nailed near St. Paul's. His name was written in bold Latin, and beneath it, the charge of treason. She said nothing. She burned the dress she'd worn the night he visited and hid the small coin he left in a floorboard beneath her bed. After that, things began to change. Agnes grew nervous. Guards walked past their house more often. Rumors spread that someone in the city was leaking information to the French. Whispers of spies, of traitors, of plots against the crown. Johanna tried to stay away from it all, but she knew better than to believe she was untouched. When men of power became afraid, it was always women like her who paid the price first. One night, the door to the house blew open in a storm. Rain poured through the threshold, and with it came something unexpected, a letter sealed in wax, left on the step, addressed to no one. Agnes read it alone in her room and didn't speak to anyone for 2 days after. Then she called Johanna upstairs. Her voice shook when she said only this: "You need to leave. Tonight." And just like that, Johanna's carefully built life began to fall apart. She didn't know what was in that letter, or who had sent it, but she knew danger when she saw it. She packed nothing. She took only her cloak, the coin hidden in the floor, and the memory of that quiet man with the scar. She didn't say goodbye to the other women. She didn't look back. Outside, the storm had settled, but the city felt colder. The streets were quieter than usual, as if something waited in the shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang out, 12 chimes. Midnight. Johanna didn't know it yet, but the next step she took would change everything. A new chapter was beginning, one that would test her silence, her strength, and every secret she had ever kept. And somewhere in the shadows, someone was already watching. Johanna moved quickly through the winding streets, her worn boots slipping on the wet stones. She kept her hood low and her steps light, not daring to look behind her. The candlelight flickering from distant windows felt like the eyes of strangers, watching but not helping. She had always known how lonely the night could be in London, but tonight it felt different, tense like the city itself was holding its breath. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she couldn't stay. Agnes had never looked scared before. Stern, yes. Harsh often, but never afraid. And that look in her eyes, tight around the edges, full of something like regret, was worse than any words Johanna could have heard. It meant something had shifted, something too dangerous to explain. It meant her time was up. She thought about running to the river, maybe finding a barge headed south. But boats didn't come freely, and the river was closely watched these days. People whispered that spies used it to escape, that bodies turned up near the docks with throats cut and pockets empty. Besides, she had no papers, no friends outside the city, and no name that carried weight. All she had was her instinct, and tonight it told her to head toward the old walls, where the forgotten parts of London still stood. The further she walked, the fewer people she saw. The inns became more silent, the windows darker, the doors locked tight. Even the rats scurried like they knew something was coming. In a narrow lane behind a collapsed chapel, Johanna ducked into a crumbling archway and rested against the stone. Her heart was pounding. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Who had sent that letter to Agnes? Why was she being warned? And most importantly, what did they know? She hadn't spoken a word about the man with the scar. Not to Agnes. Not to anyone. He hadn't even touched her. But something about him had unsettled her from the start. He'd looked at her like she was more than a harlot. Not like a woman, not like an object, but like a piece of a puzzle he was trying to solve. Now she feared she'd become part of something she didn't understand, a web already spun, the thread tightening. Rain began to fall again, softer now. It dripped through cracks in the stones and soaked her cloak, but she didn't move. She didn't know who to trust. The city was full of secrets, some bought, some stolen, some buried in silence. And silence, she'd learned, was the only shield she had. A noise broke through the stillness, a footstep, slow and deliberate. She froze. A shadow passed at the edge of the alley. Johanna held her breath and slid back into the arch, her hand wrapping around the small knife Agnes had once pressed into her palm years ago. "Never forget," Agnes had whispered. "Even a flower has thorns." The shadow moved on, turning down another street. Johanna waited until the sound of footsteps faded, then emerged slowly. She had to keep moving. As she rounded the next corner, she saw a flicker of light, dim, flickering, coming from a crooked building wedged between two crumbling walls. She recognized it. Mistress Edith's, an old healer with a bent back and sharp eyes, known for selling teas to sick children and quieting certain kinds of pain. Johanna had only visited once, years ago, when one of the girls had taken a bad beating and needed stitches no one else would give. Desperate, Johanna knocked. It took several moments, but the door opened just enough for One Eye to appear. "Who is it?" "Johanna," she whispered. "From Candlewick Street." A pause. Then the door creaked wider. Inside, the warmth of a fire greeted her, though the air still smelled of damp herbs and boiled roots. Mistress Edith didn't ask questions. She simply pointed to a stool and handed her a cloth to dry her hands. Her silence was a comfort. In a world full of noise, people like Edith survived by knowing when to stay quiet. "You're running," Edith finally said, not looking at her. "Yes. Someone after you?" "I don't know." The old woman didn't push further. She stirred a pot on the fire, added a pinch of something green, and poured 2 cups. Johanna took hers with shaky fingers. The warmth seeped in her chest, calming her nerves. "You'll need shelter," Edith said. "I know. You'll need more than that soon." "I know." The 2 women sat in silence for a while, broken only by the soft crackle of fire and the sound of distant bells ringing from the abbey. Finally, Edith stood, walked to a high shelf, and took down a folded bundle wrapped in waxcloth. She handed it to Johanna. "What's this?" "A dress," she said. "One that doesn't belong to a harlot." Johanna blinked. "Why would you?" "Because you won't make it far looking like yourself." It was true. Her face had become known in certain circles. If someone was truly watching, they wouldn't need much to follow her. She unwrapped the bundle slowly. Inside was a plain brown cloak, a servant's apron, and a cap. Unremarkable. Perfect. "There's a widow in Southwark," Edith continued. "She keeps bees. Lost her sons in the last fire. Needs help. Doesn't ask questions. You tell her Edith sent you." Johanna nodded, tucking the bundle close to her chest. She didn't have the words to thank Edith properly, but the old woman didn't seem to expect them. She just gave a nod and turned back to her fire. Johanna changed quickly behind a curtain near the hearth. The dress was scratchy and smelled faintly of smoke, but it was sturdy and warm. More importantly, it made her look like a woman no one would notice. A housemaid, a beekeeper's apprentice, someone far from the silks and rouge of her old life. She tied the apron tight and pulled the cap over her hair, tucking away the last traces of the woman she had been. Before she left, Edith handed her a pouch with 3 coins. "It's not much," she said, "but it might buy you time. I'll pay you back." "Don't." They didn't embrace. They didn't say goodbye. Edith simply opened the door and let Johanna disappear into the misty morning. The streets were different at dawn. Pale light touched the rooftops, and the air felt cleaner, quieter, like the city hadn't yet remembered who it was. Johanna moved with purpose, heading south toward the bridge. Southwick lay beyond the river, just outside the city walls. It was rough, poorer in parts, but also less watched. Fewer eyes meant fewer dangers. As she crossed the bridge, the waters of the Thames churned beneath her. Barges floated slowly past, and early market vendors were already setting up their stalls. No one looked at her twice. She kept her head down and moved like she belonged there. She reached Southwick by mid-morning. The widow's house wasn't hard to find, set near the edge of a small patch of green, with beehives neatly lined along the back fence. The smell of honey hung in the air, sweet and sharp. Johanna hesitated, then knocked twice on the wooden door. A tall woman with gray-streaked hair answered. Her face was lined with sun and time, her hands stained with wax. She looked Johanna up and down, eyes pausing on the cap, the apron, the bundle of clothes pressed to her chest. "Edith sent me," Johanna said softly. The woman didn't blink. "You know bees? I can learn." That was all it took. The days that followed were slow, filled with the soft hum of bees and the rhythm of simple work. Johanna fed the hives, strained honey, cleaned wax, and chopped wood. Her body ached in new ways, but it was a clean ache, not the bruised, hidden kind she'd carried for years. At night, she slept on a straw mattress beneath the eaves, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of lavender and smoke. The widow, whose name was Elsbeth, didn't ask questions. She spoke only when needed, usually about the bees or the weather. But she wasn't unkind. Sometimes she left an extra slice of bread on Johanna's plate, or quietly mended a tear in her dress. It was a quiet life, and for a time, Johanna believed she might disappear into it completely. But peace in those days never lasted. One evening, as the sky turned gold and the air filled with the lazy drone of bees returning to their hives, a rider appeared on the distant path. He wasn't in uniform, but his boots were clean, his cloak too fine for a farmer. He rode slowly, scanning the fields like he was searching for something or someone. Johanna was inside, pressing wax into molds, when Elsbeth appeared in the doorway. "There's a man," she said, her voice low. "Coming this way." Johanna's blood turned cold. "Did he see you?" "I don't think so." "Did you tell anyone I was here?" "No, and I never would." Johanna peered through a crack in the wooden shutter. The rider had dismounted and was speaking with a neighbor. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the neighbor point south, toward the widow's land. He was looking for her. She moved quickly, grabbed the pouch of coins, stuffed bread into a cloth, and wrapped herself in the cloak. Elsbeth didn't speak, but her hands trembled as she handed Johanna a small jar of honey and a bundle of herbs. "For luck," she said, "and for wounds." Johanna nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you." "Go through the trees," Elsbeth whispered. "Stay off the road." Johanna ran, through the back fence, past the hives, into the woods. Her breath came fast, heart pounding her chest. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Behind her, the bees swirled in lazy spirals, unaware that one of the few safe places left in the world was about to be discovered. She ran until her legs ached and her lungs burned. When she finally stopped, it was near a crumbling stone well deep in the forest. She crouched behind it, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Suddenly, a twig snapped. Someone was there. Johanna held her breath, clutching the knife hidden in her apron. Her fingers trembled around the worn handle. Then a voice, low, measured, came through the trees. "You run well." She didn't move. "I didn't come to hurt you, Johanna." The voice was familiar. Calm, British, but with a hint of something else. She slowly turned her head and saw him, half shadowed by branches. The man with the scar. The same one who had come to the brothel that night. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To warn you." She stood slowly, the knife still in her hand. "Warn me about what?" "They think you know something," he said. "Something you were never supposed to hear." "I didn't tell anyone." "I know," he interrupted, "but it doesn't matter. Someone saw us, and now they think you're part of it." Johanna's mind raced. Part of what? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked over his shoulder, scanning the trees. "You need to leave England. Disappear entirely. I have nowhere to go. I can help you. Why would you? The man stepped forward, and for the first time, she saw something new in his eyes, guilt. Because I brought this on you, he said quietly, and because I owe you more than you know. Before she could ask what he meant, they both froze. In the distance, the sound of hooves. Too many for a traveler. Too quick for farmers. They were being followed. The man looked at her sharply. We have to move. Now. Johanna didn't ask where. She just ran. And behind her, the forest came alive with the sound of riders closing in. Branches snapped under their feet as Johanna and the scarred man tore through the woods, breath catching in their throats. The ground was uneven and slick, and each step felt like it might be the one that sent her tumbling. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The sound of hooves behind them was no longer distant. It was close, urgent, and relentless. The man took the lead, guiding her through the narrowest gaps in the trees, ducking under low-hanging limbs, always checking behind them without breaking pace. Johanna's heart hammered her chest, but she kept her eyes on his back and followed without question. They reached a small stream and splashed through it, the cold water biting at her ankles. The man paused only long enough to glance at her feet, making sure she could still run. Then he turned sharply and led her uphill toward a slope blanketed in thick underbrush. They pushed through the thorns and brambles, blood beading on their skin, and climbed until the trees gave way to a rocky ridge. He stopped at the edge and motioned for her to crouch. Together, they peered back through the forest. Below them, riders were spreading out in the clearing near the stream. 4, maybe 5, all armed. They wore no uniforms, but their movements were practiced. Not ordinary guards, not common thieves. These men were hunting someone, her. Johanna turned to the man beside her. Who are they? Private guards. Hired hands. Loyal to coin, not law. He kept watching them. They were sent to silence you before anyone starts asking questions. What questions? He turned his eyes on her. What you heard that night. What I asked you. Who I was. But I didn't even know your name, she said, voice shaking. Exactly, he said. And that's the problem. He rose and motioned for her to follow again. Come on. We'll head west. I know someone who can get us to the coast. Johanna hesitated. Her legs were trembling, her lungs aching. You still haven't told me why you're helping me. He glanced at her, then away. Because I was supposed to use you. And I didn't. His words stung more than she expected. But there wasn't time to unpack the meaning. They moved again, this time through quieter terrain. The ground flattened out, and the trees thinned. The scent of salt hung in the air, faint but familiar. They were nearing the edge of the forest, closer to the sea. After an hour of silence, they came to a narrow path carved through low hills. A crumbling wall marked the entrance to what had once been a Roman outpost, long abandoned and now overtaken by moss and vines. In the shadow of a broken archway, the man stopped. We'll rest here a moment, he said. Johanna collapsed onto a patch of grass, breath ragged, her hands shaking from more than exhaustion. She glanced at the man. You still haven't told me your name. He looked down, then knelt beside her. Thomas. She studied his face. The scar across his jaw looked older now, more worn into him than it had days before. Thomas what? That's all I can give you, he said with a tired smile. She didn't press further. Instead, she leaned back against the stone and closed her eyes. For a brief moment, the warmth of the sun pushed away the cold, and the buzzing in her mind slowed. When she opened her eyes again, Thomas was watching the trees. You said someone can get us to the coast. He nodded. A merchant. Old friend. Keeps a boat in Rye. Rye's days away on foot. There's a safe house along the way. If we make it there, we'll have horses. She didn't ask what kind of people kept safe houses, or why a harlot and a spy were now suddenly connected. The lines of her life had blurred so quickly that questions felt meaningless. She had only 2 choices now. Keep running, or stop and let someone else decide her fate. Johanna stood. Let's go. They moved carefully from the ruins, staying low and avoiding open paths. They slept in ditches, under trees, beside quiet streams. They spoke little, but in the silence, something fragile began to form between them, a kind of understanding built not on trust, but on necessity. On the 4th evening, just as the sun melted into the trees and cast long shadows across the dirt road. They reached the edge of a small village. It was the kind of place travelers passed without remembering. A few stone cottages, a crooked church steeple, and a well that hadn't been cleaned in years. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, and the scent of root stew and ash lingered in the air. To anyone passing through, it looked harmless. But Thomas didn't slow down. He led Johanna around the village's outer edge into a dense cluster of trees, until they reached a wooden fence half buried under brush. Behind it stood an old farmhouse, sunken in the middle and draped in ivy. It looked abandoned at first, until Johanna noticed the flicker of a candle in the back window and the faint sound of a dog barking from somewhere within. Thomas approached the gate slowly and tapped on it twice, then once more after a pause. Nothing happened for a moment. Then a figure stepped out of the shadows near the door, a tall man with a limp and a heavy wool coat. He didn't smile, but he opened the door without speaking. Inside, the air was warm and smoky, filled with the scent of burned wood and something vaguely medicinal. The man who had let them in didn't introduce himself. He only looked Johanna over with eyes that didn't blink nearly enough. "She knows nothing," Thomas said quietly. "But they don't care." The man nodded. "Then she'll be safer out of England." He looked at Johanna again. "You ever been on a boat?" "No," she said honestly. "You'll hate it." That was all he said before turning away. Thomas led her to a back room where an old straw mattress sat beneath a low ceiling beam. A bucket of clean water and a crust of bread were on the table beside it. "Rest," he said. "We leave before dawn." Johanna sat slowly, running her hand along the edge of the blanket. She was too tired to ask questions. Her eyes closed before her head even touched the mattress. But sleep was not the comfort it once was. Her dreams were filled with flashes. Faces from Candlewick Street, Agnes's tight voice, the man with the ink-stained fingers, the sound of hooves chasing her in the dark. She awoke sometime in the night, breathing hard, her palms damp with sweat. She found Thomas sitting outside the farmhouse, sharpening a small blade by the light of the moon. He didn't look at her when she stepped into the cold night air. "Couldn't sleep?" "No," she whispered. They sat in silence for a while. Then Johanna asked, "What happens after we reach the coast?" "You'll board a ship headed for Bruges," he said. "A woman will meet you there. She helps people like us. You'll be safe. And you?" "I'll stay. But you said it's not safe for me. Why would it be safe for you?" He looked up at her finally. His eyes were tired. "It's not." "Then come with me." Thomas gave a small smile and shook his head. "I'm already marked. But you could start over. Be someone else." "I've been someone else for years," Johanna said softly. "I don't know if I remember who I really am." He studied her face for a long moment. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe this time you get to choose." Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the trees again, soft but sure, approaching fast. Thomas shot to his feet and pulled her toward the side of the house. A sharp whistle rang through the trees, and the man from the house appeared a moment later, carrying 2 satchels and a sword tied at his waist. "No time," he said. "They've found the trail." They mounted 2 old horses tied near the shed and rode hard through the narrow wood paths. Johanna clung to the reins, heart pounding. The wind cut through her cloak, but fear kept her warm. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The only way out was forward. They rode until dawn. When they finally reached the edge of the cliffs near Rye, the sea stretched wide and gray before them. Below, a small fishing boat waited in the shallows, its sail barely visible in the morning mist. Thomas helped her down from the horse. "Go. They won't search the sea. And you." He looked down at her with a soft, sad expression. "This is where I end." She reached for his hand. "You saved me." "No," he said gently. "You saved yourself. I just gave you time." A shout rang out from the hills behind them. They turned, 3 riders on the ridge. "Go," he urged. Johanna ran, feet slipping in the damp grass, her breath caught in her throat. She splashed through the cold surf, climbed into the boat, and turned back just in time to see Thomas draw his blade. The ship pulled away slowly, the tide carrying it toward the open sea. As the mist closed around her, the sound of steel and shouting faded. and she was gone. The sea rocked gently beneath the boat as Johanna sat curled near the bow, her cloak damp and her thoughts tangled. The mist hung thick around her, softening the edges of the world, but her mind wouldn't quiet. Each wave carried her further from the only life she had known. Yet she couldn't stop wondering what had happened on the cliffs behind her. She had seen Thomas draw his blade, had heard the shouts and the pounding hooves, but she didn't know how it ended. And that silence, no scream, no final word, was worse than knowing. It left a gap in her chest that pulsed with every breath. The man steering the boat said little. He was old, with hands like tree bark and a mouth full of broken teeth. He didn't seem curious about her name or her past. He only asked once if she had anything valuable on her, and when she shook her head, he grunted and kept rowing. The boat creaked with each pull of the oars, and the coastline slowly vanished behind them, swallowed by gray light and distance. After a long stretch of silence, he finally muttered, "You're not the first girl I've taken across." She looked up. "How many?" "Too many." He didn't say more. The crossing took hours. Cold water splashed up over the sides, soaking her feet, and her hands went numb trying to hold onto the bench. When land finally appeared, a dark smudge rising out of fog, relief mingled with dread. She had made it across the sea, but what now? She didn't know anyone in Bruges. She didn't speak the language. She had no money, no documents, no home. Only her name and the memory of a man who had tried to help her. They docked near a small inlet just south of the main port. The old man helped her climb onto the stone pier and handed her a small cloth bundle without explanation. Inside was a heel of bread, a coin wrapped in wool, and a slip of parchment with a single name written on it. Anika. Ask for her at the dye house, he said, already turning back to his boat. She'll know what to do. Johanna clutched the note tightly and walked inland. The streets of Bruges were quieter than London, but carried the same weight. The same wary eyes peering from doorways, the same whispers tucked into alleys. She passed weavers, bakers, merchants shouting in a language she could only half understand. Everything felt strange, too clean in some places and too broken in others. She walked past canals and stone bridges, trying not to look lost. The dye house was tucked behind a tannery, its walls stained red and purple from years of work. A heavy woman stood in the doorway, her apron soaked and her arms crossed. When Johanna approached and showed her the parchment, the woman's eyes narrowed. "You're late," Anika said, though her voice held more caution than anger. "Come inside." Johanna followed her through a narrow hallway that opened into a large room filled with vats of steaming liquid. The air burned her nose with sharp smells: vinegar, wet wool, crushed berries. Several other women worked in silence, dunking fabrics and hanging them on thick ropes. Anika led her upstairs to a cramped room with a straw bed and a basin of water. "You'll sleep here," she said. "You work like the rest. No favors." Johanna nodded. "Thank you." Anika paused in the doorway. "You say nothing to no one about why you came." "Understood. I understand." And just like that, Johanna began again. The work was rough but honest. She carried buckets, stirred dye, scrubbed floors. Her fingers were always stained, her back sore, but the labor was steady and the roof didn't leak. The other women kept to themselves, though one girl named Liesel sometimes smiled at her. At night, Johanna lay awake and thought of London, of Agnes, of Thomas. She imagined them still moving through the city like shadows, unseen, unheard, but still breathing. Weeks passed, then months. She learned a few words in the local tongue, enough to follow orders, enough to avoid mistakes. Anika watched her closely, always seeming to weigh whether Johanna could be trusted. And Johanna gave her no reason to doubt. She worked hard, spoke little, and kept her secrets buried. But the past has a way of catching up, even across the sea. It began one morning with a man outside the dye house, dressed in black with fine boots and a quiet voice. He said he was there to purchase dyed linen for a noble household. Anika nodded and took him through the back, but Johanna saw the way her shoulders stiffened. When a man passed Johanna on his way out, he looked at her a second too long. Not curious, not kind, calculating. That night, Anika knocked on Johanna's door. "He asked for you," she said. By description, Johanna sat up. Who was he? Didn't say, but he left a message. Anika handed her a folded paper. Inside, in careful writing, were only 5 words. "You are never invisible, girl." Johanna felt her hands go cold. "I don't want trouble," Anika said. "If you brought it here, you leave by morning." "I understand," Johanna whispered. After she left, Johanna stared at the note for a long time. Then she burned it in the basin, watching the edges curl and turn to ash. Someone had followed her, or maybe they had never stopped watching. She couldn't run again, not without knowing what she was running from. That night, she made her decision. She would find out who the man was, why he had come, and if there was something buried in her past that made her a target, she had to dig it out before someone else did. Because what scared her more than being hunted was not knowing why. The morning came quietly, with soft light spilling through the small window above Johanna's bed. She hadn't slept. Her thoughts turned in circles, and her body, though still, carried the restless ache of someone who no longer belonged where she stood. The dye house bustled below her, Anika barking orders, the women filling vats, water sloshing across the floor. But Johanna stayed in her room longer than usual, pacing with bare feet on the cold wood, trying to decide if she was truly ready for what she was about to do. She didn't know where to begin. The man had vanished without a trace, leaving only those 5 cruel words behind. "You were never invisible, girl." The way it was written, formal, deliberate, it wasn't a threat in haste. It was a warning with patience that scared her more than anything. Whoever sent it had taken their time. They had waited until she was comfortable again, until she started believing she could live a normal life. When she finally went downstairs, Anika barely looked at her. There was no anger, but the space between them had grown colder. Distrust lingered in every glance now. Johanna didn't blame her. This place had rules. Stay quiet, keep working, don't bring the outside world inside. And Johanna had broken that, even if she hadn't meant to. She worked until midday, then slipped away during the lunch hour. Bruges wasn't large, but it was full of pockets where people vanished. She wore a simple shawl and kept her head down, walking the stone streets as if she had a purpose. Her feet carried her toward the old part of the city, near the river, where traders kept stalls and strangers passed through unnoticed. Her first stop was the printer's shop. It was small, tucked between a spice merchant and a candle maker. She had passed it before, always drawn to the neat rows of letters pressed behind the glass. Today she stepped inside. A young man with ink-stained fingers looked up from his table. "Looking for something?" he asked in a thick Flemish accent. "I need to know who in Bruges buys imported parchment," she said, quietly but clearly. "Fine paper." "Thin. From England." The man blinked. "Strange question." "I'm looking for someone who sent a message. Someone careful." He studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "Not many buyers for that kind of thing. Only the gentry. Scribes for the court. Church sometimes. A few merchants with money to waste." "Anyone recent?" "Just one," he said. "A man who didn't give his name. Came 2 weeks ago. Bought enough to write a book, but left with just a page." "Did he leave anything else?" The printer hesitated, then reached under the table and pulled out a small scrap of parchment. "He made a mistake. Wrote too fast and crumpled this before he left. I meant to burn it." Johanna took the scrap. The writing was rushed but familiar, tight and angled, with a sharp line through each T. It wasn't the same neat script as the note she'd burned, but it was the same hand. Whoever this man was, he hadn't just come to send a message. He'd come to watch her. She thanked the printer and left, heart pounding again. She didn't have much, but she had enough. A time, a place, a hand. The next place she went was the market square. From a small vendor who sold wool scraps, she bought a cheap hat and gloves. From another, a strip of linen she could fold into a scarf. She didn't need warmth. She needed disguise. Then she waited near the edge of the square, leaning against a wall, watching every face that passed. An hour went by, then 2, and then she saw him. Same boots, same coat, a different hat, but the way he carried himself hadn't changed. Tall, composed, eyes always moving, never settling on any one thing for too long. He walked with the ease of a man who knew this part of the city well enough to pretend he didn't. Johanna followed. He didn't lead her far, just 2 streets down, into a quiet alley beside a stone church. There, he stopped near a water trough and waited. He turned before she could hide. "I was wondering when you'd find me," he said in English, his voice smooth but tired. Thomas would be proud. At the sound of the name, Johanna froze. "You knew him?" The man smiled faintly. "More than you did." She didn't step closer. "Why are you following me?" "Because you're the last piece." "Of what?" He looked at her for a long time, as if weighing whether she could bear the truth. "Of a message. Something Thomas died trying to pass on." Her throat tightened. "He's dead." The man nodded slowly. "The moment you got on that boat, he gave himself up. He led them away. Bought you time." Johanna's knees felt weak. She leaned against the wall, blinking hard. "And the message? He gave it to you, whether he meant to or not. He asked you questions, told you names. You may not remember now, but something he said was important. A detail, a location, a person. I don't know anything," she said. "Not yet," the man agreed. "But you will. And when you do, they'll come for you again." Johanna shook her head. "I'm just one person." "Yes," he said, "which is why they fear you. No one watches a harlot. No one expects her to matter." That was the brilliance of Thomas's plan. Hide the truth where no one would ever look. She stared at him. "So what now? Do I keep running?" He stepped forward and pressed a small leather pouch into her hand. "No. You prepare." She opened it carefully. Inside was a folded map, 3 gold coins, and a name, Father Lambert. "Calais, asterisk, asterisk. He'll help you remember," the man said. "If you want answers, you go to him. And if I don't," the man looked over his shoulder, "then you wait for them to find you again." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the alley, leaving Johanna alone beneath the ringing of distant church bells and the cold weight of everything she didn't yet understand. And far above them, from a small window in the church tower, another pair of eyes was already watching. Johanna stayed in the alley long after the man had vanished, her breath curling in the cold air as she clutched the pouch to her chest. She didn't know who he truly was, just that he spoke with the certainty of someone who had seen too much and survived more than most. Everything he had said pressed against her thoughts like the tide, unrelenting, inescapable. Thomas had died for her to escape, and now it seemed he had died for something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. A message hidden in plain sight, hidden in her. She unfolded the map with shaking fingers. It was marked with a faint red line running north, hugging the coastline toward Calais. The path cut through marshes, small villages, and forest roads. Not the safest route, but safe didn't seem to be part of her world anymore. She didn't go back to the dye house. She couldn't, not with eyes still watching from shadows and strangers asking questions. Anika had given her shelter, but it had come with rules, and now she had broken the most important one. She'd brought danger too close. The right thing now was to disappear completely before someone else got hurt for knowing her. So she did what she'd done before, melted into the city. For 2 days, Johanna slept in the corner of an abandoned grain shed near the docks. She ate scraps, traded the coin from the pouch for a wool cloak that smelled of smoke, and listened closely to what people whispered. There were murmurs of missing girls, of English spies slipping through the ports, of riders asking questions in towns south of Bruges. The world she had once known, the brothel, the dirty streets, the rules she'd memorized, felt like it belonged to someone else now. Someone who no longer existed. On the 3rd morning, she left before sunrise. The journey to Calais began with silence. Thick fog rolled over the fields, muffling her footsteps and blurring the road. She traveled on foot, keeping to the smaller paths, avoiding crossroads and main roads where carriages passed. She passed shepherds who didn't look up, children gathering firewood who barely glanced her way, and old women selling bread and eggs from carts. In their eyes, she was no one. And for now, that was exactly what she needed to be. But the further she walked, the heavier the silence became. Every sound, wind rustling trees, birds taking flight, set her nerves on edge. She slept in empty barns or under trees, her knife close by, her cloak wrapped tightly around her. Every night, she dreamed of Thomas's face. Not the way he looked when she left, but how he had looked when he first stepped into the brothel. Curious, intense, and already marked by some quiet sorrow she hadn't understood then. He had trusted her with something, even if she didn't remember what. By the seventh day, her boots were torn, and the skin around her ankles had cracked. She wrapped them with spare cloth torn from the hem of her dress and pressed on. Hunger gnawed at her constantly, and though she rationed the bread she bought in small villages, it was never enough. Still, she kept moving. On the ninth day, she reached the edge of the coast. The sea wind hit her hard, colder than she remembered, filled with salt and grit. The road turned sharply toward Calais, and there, on the horizon, she saw the shape of the town rising from the mist, stone walls, watchtowers, sails bobbing in the harbor. And somewhere within those walls, a man named Father Lambert was waiting. She entered the town as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in orange and gray. It was busier than she expected. Merchants shouted in the square, sailors drank by the piers, and carts rattled through the cobbled streets. She kept her head low and her steps steady. At a chapel near the center of town, she stopped. It was small, worn with age, the stone weathered and the bell cracked. But there was life inside, candlelight flickering behind stained glass, and the faint sound of hymns echoing softly. Johanna stepped through the doorway and into the quiet warmth of the chapel. A thin man in a dark robe stood near the altar, lighting the final candle. His back was straight, his movements calm. When he turned, his eyes settled on her with a kind of knowing. "You must be Johanna," he said gently. She swallowed hard. "Yes." He nodded. "Thomas said you might come." Her breath caught. So it's true. He did leave something. The priest walked toward her, his voice low. "He left you. That was the plan all along. To keep the truth safe, it had to be hidden inside a person, not a letter. Memories are harder to steal. But I don't remember anything," she said, voice tight. "I don't know what he told me or why it matters." "You will," Father Lambert said. "Memories return in fragments, often when we stop running." She sat heavily in one of the pews, her body too tired to hold the weight of this new truth. "He said they'd come again," she whispered. "They will," the priest replied, "because they believe you know what he knew." "And what was that?" Father Lambert looked toward the altar. "That someone high in the crown's court is working with foreign hands. That names have been sold, routes betrayed, and lives traded for gold. And that somewhere, hidden in what Thomas told you, is the proof." Johanna felt her pulse quicken. "So, they want to silence me," she said. "Yes, before you remember." She looked up at him. "Then help me remember." The priest studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "I will," he said. "But you must understand, what you're walking into now is not a world of shadows. It is a world of choices, and every one of them will cost you something." Johanna stared into the flickering candlelight. "I've already lost everything," she said quietly. "What's left to fear?" Outside, night had fully fallen. But inside the chapel, the candles burned on, soft, steady, and waiting. Father Lambert led Johanna to a small stone room behind the chapel. It smelled of old parchment and beeswax, and every wall was lined with shelves crammed full of books, scrolls, and boxes sealed with wax. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the floor. The priest motioned for her to sit at a narrow wooden desk near the corner. She did, folding her hands tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. "You've been running," Lambert said quietly, "and now you must do the opposite. You must slow down, listen, and remember." Johanna looked at him, her voice barely audible. "But I don't know where to begin." He opened a small wooden drawer and pulled out a worn leather notebook. The edges were frayed, and the cover bore the faint impression of a cross. He set it on the desk and pushed it toward her. "This was Thomas's," he said. "He left it with me 2 years ago. Told me to give it to you if you ever came." Johanna hesitated, then opened it slowly. Inside, the first page held a name, hers. Below it, in Thomas's neat, sharp handwriting, were words that stopped her breath. Asterisk, she remembers without knowing. hide the truth in plain sight. She will carry it, even when she cannot see it. Asterisk. Page after page was filled with small observations, dates, places, names she didn't recognize, scattered pieces of something much larger. Some were just fragments. Woolwich Docks, no manifest. Frenchman in gray coat, paid in coin, not favor. Code embedded in ledger, tell Johanna when safe. She turned the pages slowly, eyes darting from one cryptic line to the next. Each one sent a chill through her. Something inside her stirred, a feeling just out of reach, like catching sight of someone familiar in a crowd, but not being able to place their face. The words didn't form a picture yet, but they were trying to. Father Lambert sat across from her, his voice calm. He was tracking shipments, people, secrets being moved across borders. Something too big to speak aloud. He told me things, Johanna said, trying to steady her thoughts. Back at the brothel, he talked about his past, his work, but I didn't know it meant anything. I thought he was just lost. Thomas was never lost, Lambert said, but he made people think he was. That was his gift. She traced her fingers along the edges of the page. What am I supposed to do with this? Lambert stood and walked to a shelf, pulling down a small scroll tied with blue thread. He untied it and spread it on the table beside her. It was a hand-drawn map, older than the one Thomas had left her. It showed southern England, the coastline, and several towns marked in red ink. Among them, Canterbury, Dover, Maidstone, and one name circled twice. Asterisk, asterisk, Gravesend, asterisk, asterisk. Gravesend, Johanna said aloud. Lambert nodded. That's where he traced the payments, where the names were exchanged. And you think I saw something there? She asked. Not saw, he said, but perhaps heard, or were told. Something you dismissed as unimportant. Johanna closed her eyes, trying to search the fog of her memories. The days before she fled were a blur. Faces, whispers, the smell of ink and burning oil, the cold hands of winter creeping into her room each night. But then there was something. A night with Thomas. He had been tense, his voice lower than usual. He had mentioned a man, someone above him, a man who wore the crest of a lion, even though he was no knight. She couldn't remember the name, but the moment returned with sharp clarity. The way Thomas had gripped her arm, just for a second, his eyes full of warning. She looked up at Lambert. He said the betrayal started with a man who walks like a noble, but hides in plain clothes. A man who speaks the king's English, but not in front of his men. He said, don't forget the lion's badge. Lambert stiffened. A lion's badge? She nodded slowly. On the ring he wore. The priest turned to a chest in the corner of the room and opened it. He pulled out a thin book bound in green cloth. Inside were drawings, sketches of insignias, rings, and family crests. He flipped through quickly until he stopped at a page showing a gold ring with a lion engraved on the face. That's it, Johanna said, pointing. Lambert's brow furrowed. This belongs to the Harrow family, one of the Crown's most trusted trading partners. They handle arms shipments, grain supplies, even troop movements unofficially. Johanna's stomach sank. So if Thomas was right, he was tracking a leak at the highest level. Lambert finished. She looked at the notebook again. But why give it to me? Why hide it in me? Because they wouldn't suspect you, Lambert said. To them, you were nothing more than a girl in a brothel. But Thomas knew the truth. He knew that being overlooked could be your greatest weapon. She ran her hand down the page, overwhelmed. I don't know if I can do this. You can, Lambert said gently. But you must choose it. She closed the notebook. What happens if I don't? He met her eyes, solemn. Then others will die, and everything Thomas gave his life for will vanish. Outside, the wind howled against the old stones of the chapel. The sea was rising, and with it, the storm Thomas had tried to delay. Johanna stood slowly, the notebook in her arms. I'll go to Gravesend, she said, voice steady. Lambert gave a single nod. Then you'd better leave tonight. As she packed what little she had, cloak, map, coins, notebook, she glanced once more at the flickering candles lining the wall. She wasn't the girl who had fled London in the night. She wasn't just a harlot anymore. She was something more, something unexpected. And as the chapel doors opened and the wind caught her cloak, Johanna stepped into the dark with purpose, ready to follow the path Thomas had left behind, even if it led straight into the lion's den. The road to Gravesend was long, narrow, and riddled with more than just puddles and potholes. Johanna traveled by night, keeping close to trees, resting in barns, and moving swiftly through villages that didn't ask questions. The worn notebook stayed with her at all times, hidden under her cloak, pressed against her chest like a second heartbeat. It was the only thing Thomas had left her, a puzzle that could burn kingdoms if put into the wrong hands. And someone was still chasing that fire. She didn't know who to trust, only that the wrong eyes were always watching. Twice along the road, she caught glimpses of figures that kept pace from a distance. First near the edge of a market square in Folkestone, and again 2 days later beside a ruined chapel at dusk. Neither stepped forward. Neither needed to. Their presence was a message in itself. We haven't forgotten you. In the quieter moments, Johanna thought of the man with the lion's ring. If Thomas had been right, this figure, noble in name only, was the thread unraveling a web of secrets far larger than betrayal. Armed shipments, troop movements, names being sold. And for what? Power? Coin? She didn't know yet. But Thomas had died to protect whatever truth he'd uncovered, and she had carried it unknowingly for far too long. The closer she got to Gravesend, the more she began to sense something deeper was at play. Gravesend wasn't just a port town. It was a point of exchange. People and goods moved through it like breath through lungs, quietly, constantly. If someone wanted to smuggle something, or someone without the crown noticing, it was the perfect place. She arrived just before dawn on a cold, gray morning. Fog hugged the streets, and lanterns flickered in doorways. She moved through the narrow lanes with care, watching for signs Thomas had left in the notebook, symbols, street names, coded phrases he'd scribbled without explanation. On the 3rd page, she found one word circled twice, Wellings. It meant nothing at first, but then she passed a narrow alley behind a grain store and saw a faded wooden sign hanging from a hook above a door. Wellings and Sons, Rope and Sail Repair. Johanna slipped inside the shop as the owner, a thin man with a stoop and milky eyes, was arranging coils of rope. "Looking for work?" he asked without looking up. "No," she said carefully. "Looking for what Thomas left." The man's hands froze. He looked at her now long and hard. "Name?" "Johanna." He nodded slowly and motioned for her to follow him into the back. There, among the rope piles and oil lamps, he pulled aside a crate and tapped on a floorboard. A hollow echo. Then he lifted it, revealing a bundle wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her without a word. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside were several folded pages of thick parchment, maps, ledgers, and letters, some written in code. One page caught her breath. It was a shipping manifest bearing a royal seal. But beside the list of goods, grain, flax, wine, were faint notes scribbled in another hand. Asterisk troops rerouted. Arms off book. Courier name, F star. The rest had been smudged, possibly by water or deliberate hands. This proves it, Johanna said. It hints at it, the man replied. Proving it will take more. She turned to him. Why keep this here? Because Thomas asked me to. He knew they'd search his rooms, his old friends, even the church records. But no one looks in a rope shop. She folded the documents and tucked them into her bag. Thank you. Be careful, the man warned. They've got ears in every corner now. Especially here. Johanna nodded and slipped out the back. The fog had lifted slightly, but the air still felt heavy. She walked quickly, heading toward the edge of the town, thinking of her next move. She needed someone who could read the code in the ledgers. Someone who wasn't already bought or hunted. She needed allies. But as she turned down a quiet street, she saw a familiar face waiting by a lamppost. Liesel from the dye house. Her hair was braided, her hands stuffed in her sleeves. She looked up, and their eyes met. What are you doing here? Johanna asked, stunned. Liesel stepped closer, keeping her voice low. They followed you after Bruges. I tried to warn you, but Anika wouldn't let me leave until they were gone. I left 2 days later. Found a priest. He told me you were headed here. Johanna felt a sharp knot in her chest. You shouldn't have come. I had to, Liesel said. They think I don't matter, that I was just another hand in the dye vats. But I've been listening for years. I know the men you're running from. One of them visited the house once, months ago, looking for a girl who wasn't even there. He asked too many questions. Johanna narrowed her eyes. Do you remember his name? Liesel nodded. He called himself Finch. Always wore gloves. Spoke like a noble, but too clean, like it was practiced. Johanna froze. Finch, the same initial from the coded manifest. Courier name, F. Her breath caught. He's involved in this. He's more than involved, Liesel whispered. He's the one giving orders now. And he's not working alone. Johanna's heart pounded. Then we need to be gone before nightfall. But Liesel didn't move. Her expression shifted, eyes darkening. There's more. I think someone inside the Crown's office is helping him. Someone high up. They're leaking troop locations, but only the ones moving through coastal towns. So it's a smuggling route, Johanna said, realization dawning. They're hiding behind legitimate shipments. Arms, men, even documents. And if you make the wrong move, Liesel said, they'll erase you like you were never born. The weight of it settled in Johanna's chest. She had only scratched the surface, and already the consequences were spiraling. Thomas had left her a thread, but it led into a tangled net of betrayal and corruption stretching further than either of them had imagined. We need to disappear again, she said. But this time, Liesel replied, not to run, to plan. As they moved through Gravesend's alleys toward a safe house Thomas had once marked in his notebook, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the street. A tall man with gloves, a ring with a lion crest catching the last light of day. And behind him, two others silent, waiting. Because Johanna wasn't just carrying a message anymore. She had become the message. The safe house was tucked behind an abandoned candle workshop near the river's edge, surrounded by rusted carts and overgrown grass. It was quiet, too quiet, just the way Thomas would have liked it. The walls were thick, the windows small, and the door groaned as Johanna pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of old wax and dust, but the shelves were still lined with supplies. Blank parchment, dried food, and tools no one had touched in years. Liesel stepped inside after her and closed the door quickly. It looks untouched, she said softly. It should, Johanna replied. Thomas made sure of that. He had places like this scattered across port towns. They moved through the space slowly, checking the corners and counting the escape routes. Once she was sure they were alone, Johanna set the bag down and unwrapped the documents she'd taken from Welling's shop. She spread them across the table. The manifest, the coded ledger, and the letters bearing the royal seal. Liesel leaned in. The handwriting here, it's the same as Finch's. I saw it once when he signed the dye house registry. I didn't forget. You're sure? As sure as I've ever been of anything. Johanna ran her finger across the page. So he's not just a courier. He's managing the routes, signing off on them. That puts him deep in the operation. She reached for Thomas's notebook again, flipping through the pages until she found one entry she hadn't understood before. It read, "The lion signs below the wolf." What does that mean? Liesel asked. Johanna shook her head slowly. Maybe it's a symbol. Someone higher than Finch. Then Finch is just the beginning, Liesel whispered. A knock rang softly on the door. They both froze. Another knock. This time, 2 quick taps followed by one long one. Johanna exhaled sharply. That's the priest's signal. She moved to the door and opened it slowly. Father Lambert stepped inside quickly and shut the door behind him. He looked tired, and his cloak was soaked from the fog outside. They know you're here, he said at once. 3 men questioned a merchant an hour ago. They're circling the docks. We're leaving, Johanna said. Lambert looked at the papers. Not yet. Not until we're sure what we're dealing with. We know Finch is tied to the smuggling routes, she replied. We know he's using the Crown's own shipments. That's not enough, Lambert said. You'll need more than whispers and stolen ink to expose a man like him. You need proof that can't be denied. Johanna sat down again. What would that look like? A ledger with his seal. A signed order. Testimony from someone inside the ring. Something they can't burn or deny when it goes public. Liesel crossed her arms. And where do we find that? Lambert hesitated. Then he pulled a folded piece of parchment from his sleeve and laid it on the table. It was a map, more detailed than the others. This one focused on a single building, a manor house outside Dover, with thick black lines outlining its walls and annotations in the margins. "This is Finch's estate," he said, "but he rarely stays there. The house is guarded, but not watched as heavily as the ports. If he keeps records, they'll be there." "You want us to break into his home?" Johanna said quietly. "I don't want you to do anything," Lambert replied, "but I know you will." Johanna leaned back, her mind racing. If Thomas had believed she was the key, if Finch truly was the man behind it all, or one piece of it, then the manor might hold everything they needed. But it wouldn't be easy. Not now, with spies everywhere and time running out. Still, she looked at Liesel. "Would you go with me?" The girl didn't hesitate. "I already have." That night, under cover of a moonless sky, they left Gravesend. Father Lambert arranged for a small fishing cart to carry them past the patrol roads. The driver didn't speak, only nodded when given coin and pointed them toward the old forest road that led toward Dover. They traveled in silence, wrapped in wool, their breath clouding in the cold. Every bump on the road rattled Johanna's nerves. She clutched the notebook like a lifeline, replaying every word Thomas had ever said about Finch, how he operated in silence, how he masked power behind politeness, how his cruelty wore a gentleman's smile. It was nearly dawn when they saw the manor on the horizon. It sat on a small rise above the sea, surrounded by trees stripped bare by winter. A low stone wall circled the estate, and torchlight glowed faintly at the main gate. The building itself was wide, built in gray stone, with 3 chimneys and a tower that overlooked the cliff's edge. It looked calm still. Johanna's stomach twisted. Nothing about this place felt calm. They ditched the cart a mile from the gate and continued on foot, staying low, circling through the woods until they reached the back of the estate. There, near a narrow servant entrance, the wall had crumbled in one section. Johanna slid through first, then helped Liesel over. They crouched behind a hedgerow, watching the shadows shift around the windows. "No movement yet." Johanna whispered, "Once inside, we split. We don't take anything unless it's sealed or signed. We find the ledgers. We get out." Liesel nodded. "And if we're caught?" "We don't get caught." They waited until a guard passed, then slipped into the side entrance. The kitchen was dark, the hearth cold. Dust lined the shelves. This part of the house hadn't been used in days. They crept through the halls in silence, the floorboards creaking with every step. On the second floor, Johanna found a study. The door was locked, but the wood around it had rotted slightly at the base. With enough pressure, she forced it open. Inside, moonlight spilled across a wide desk, stacked with scrolls and bound books. She moved quickly, opening drawers, checking the shelves. Most of it was normal correspondence, estate affairs, wine orders, shipping schedules. Then she found a drawer sealed with wax. The crest imprinted into it, a lion. She broke the seal. Inside, a red leather-bound ledger. She opened it. The first page bore Finch's name. Below it, dates and transactions. Weapons marked as wine. Troops rerouted under false orders. Signatures from lesser-known officials. All meticulously recorded. Her fingers trembled. This was it. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. She turned, and found Liesel staring wide-eyed from the doorway. "Someone's in the house," she whispered. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. Johanna tucked the ledger into her cloak and blew out the candle. They were out of time. Johanna didn't hesitate. She grabbed Liesel by the hand and pulled her back through the doorway just as the heavy footsteps reached the top of the stairs. The 2 girls moved fast, silent, slipping into the dark hallway and ducking behind a tall cabinet as the door to the study creaked open behind them. A man stepped inside. They couldn't see his face clearly, only his shadow stretching long across the floor, but the sound of the boots told her everything. This was someone used to command, someone who wasn't afraid to be heard. She held her breath as the silence in the hallway stretched unbearably long. Then came the distinct snap of a match, and candlelight flickered under the doorframe. A low voice cursed softly. He had seen the broken seal. Liesel leaned close, whispering so faintly Johanna could barely hear her. "We can't go back the way we came." Johanna nodded. If they tried the kitchen again, they'd be cornered in seconds. But Thomas had once said something about these old manor houses. A servant's path always had more than one exit. They slid further down the hallway, checking each door. The third opened into a linen closet, but inside was a narrow stairway, steep and curved tightly into the wall. Without a word, they slipped inside and shut the door behind them, plunging into pitch darkness. The stairs groaned under their weight, and each step felt like it echoed down through stone and silence. At the bottom, they emerged into a cramped hallway lit only by moonlight through high cellar windows. The walls were lined with crates and barrels, the air damp and sour with the smell of aging wine and salt. "This way," Johanna whispered, her voice more confident than she felt. They crept toward the end of the hallway, where another wooden door waited. As Johanna reached for the latch, she heard voices above, sharp, angry, one of them shouting for the guards. "Go," she urged, shoving the door open. Outside, a garden sloped downward toward the cliffs. The wind hit them hard, ripping at their cloaks as they ran across the wet grass. Behind them, lights flared in the windows and a bell began to ring. One sharp clang, then another, then more in rhythm. The house was awake now, and they were no longer shadows. They dove behind a stone wall at the edge of the property. Beyond it, a narrow path wound down toward a rocky stretch of beach. "That path won't be guarded," Liesel panted. Johanna glanced back once. Figures were pouring out of the manor now, shouting, carrying torches. She tightened her grip on the hidden ledger inside her cloak. Then they ran again. The path was treacherous, slick with moss, and sloping dangerously in places, but they made it down to the beach without falling. The waves crashed violently just feet away, and the dark stretch of sand offered little cover. But they followed it anyway, staying low, moving south. Only when the lights of the manor had vanished behind a bend in the cliffs did Johanna finally stop, her chest heaving. Liesel leaned on her knees, coughing, face flushed. "That," Liesel started, breathless, "was the stupidest thing we've ever done." "And maybe the most important," Johanna replied. They found shelter in an old fish shack near the docks, its door barely hanging on its hinges, but it was dry, and it was hidden. Inside, Johanna lit a small lantern with shaking hands and finally pulled out the red leather ledger. They sat on the floor, the book between them. The entries confirmed everything Thomas had warned about. Smuggled weapons disguised in grain shipments. Troop movements leaked to foreign ports. Names, some crossed out, some underlined, listed beside dates and currencies. Finch's signature appeared often, always neat, always precise. But what chilled Johanna most were the entries marked with a different seal, a lion above crossed swords. "That wasn't Finch's crest." "That's the one," Liesel said. "The one Thomas called the wolf hiding under the lion." Johanna touched the mark. "So there's someone else. Someone above Finch." She turned another page. Near the bottom was a list of transactions labeled only with initials. One in particular stood out. S.H. Johanna's blood ran cold. She'd seen those initials before, written beside a payment in Thomas's notebook. At the time, it had meant nothing. "S.H.," she said aloud. "He must be the wolf." Liesel frowned. "Who is he?" Johanna didn't answer right away. She was already flipping back through the notebook, scanning pages, searching for another mention. Near the back, almost like an afterthought, Thomas had scribbled a line. Asterisk the lion answers to the wolf. "SH is the root. Asterisk." Johanna looked up. "If we can find out who he is, we'll finally know who's pulling all the strings." Liesel leaned back against the wall. "And what then? Do we bring it to the crown? The courts? If we live long enough," Johanna said. They stayed in the shack until dawn, taking turns resting, watching the road. No one came, but neither of them expected the quiet to last long. By midday, they were on the move again, heading toward a village Johanna remembered from her childhood, a place where she had once hidden in the stables during a storm, where no one knew her name and no one asked questions. They needed time to plan, to understand what they had. and they needed someone who could help them spread it, someone outside the system, someone the crown couldn't reach. As they walked, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of smoke and salt. The cliffs rose around them, and the sea crashed below. The sky was wide and gray and heavy with something unspoken. In Johanna's hands, the ledger felt like more than just pages and ink. It felt like a spark that could burn everything. And somewhere far behind them, in the highest room of the manor, a man stood at the window with a lion's ring on his finger, a broken seal in his hand, and a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He had read the name she took. He knew she was still alive, and he was already sending men to find her. The village sat nestled between two low hills, surrounded by forest that muffled the sound of the wind and sea. It was the kind of place no one visited unless they had reason, the kind of place where names weren't asked and silence was respected. Johanna and Liesel arrived just before dusk, cloaked in dirt and exhaustion. They found an old shepherd's hut on the edge of the village, long abandoned, half swallowed by ivy. It would do. Johanna lit a small fire inside, careful not to let the smoke rise too high. As the flames crackled, she laid out the ledger again, each page now memorized but still just as heavy. Every name listed in those pages, every coin exchanged, every rerouted shipment, it all pointed to something bigger than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about weapons or bribes. This was about war. Quiet, creeping war. The kind that rotted kingdoms from within. Liesel sat across from her, sharpening the dull blade they had found in a drawer beneath the fish shack's bench. "You still haven't told me what you plan to do with it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Johanna looked at the fire. "It has to be seen. All of it. Not just by priests or hidden allies. By people who can make it spread. If we disappear, this story can't die with us. And if we don't disappear fast enough." Johanna didn't answer. They both knew the risk now. The man with the lion's ring, Finch, and whoever this S.H. truly was, they weren't going to let this ledger become public. Not without a fight. That night, they were restless. Sleep came in broken moments. At one point, Johanna jolted awake, heart pounding, convinced she'd heard footsteps outside the hut. But when she slipped to the door and peered out into the dark, there was nothing. Only the soft creak of trees and the rustle of leaves in the wind. The next morning, Father Lambert arrived. He came walking down the hill alone, covered in dust, his cloak tattered, but his eyes sharp. Johanna saw him from the window and met him at the edge of the clearing. "They know where you are," he said before she could speak. "Finch's men passed through Dover last night. 3 riders, dressed as merchants. They're tracking something, or someone." Johanna's throat tightened. "Then we don't have long." Lambert pulled a folded sheet from his sleeve. It was a letter bearing the seal of a noble house, one she didn't recognize. "I went digging," he said. "S.H. is not just a merchant or officer. He's a knight, Sir Harold of Kent, close to the crown, trusted even, which means if you accuse him without proof, they'll hang you for treason before you say your second word." Johanna held the ledger tighter. "Then this has to be enough." Lambert hesitated. "It could be, if it reaches the right person." She looked up at him. "Who?" "There's a scribe," Lambert said. "In London. William Dane. He was once part of the royal court before he was cast out for speaking too loudly. Now he publishes broadsheets. Dangerous ones. Stories the crown doesn't want heard. If you give this to him, he'll print it. He'll spread it. And once it's public, they can't deny it anymore." Johanna nodded slowly. "Then that's where we go." But even as she said the words, something in the wind shifted. She turned. On the ridge above the trees, a shadow moved. Then another. Liesel stepped out of the hut, eyes wide. "Johanna," she whispered, "we have to go now." There was no time to gather everything. Johanna shoved the ledger into her pack, slung it over her shoulder, and grabbed Liesel's hand. Father Lambert stayed behind a moment longer, watching the ridge with narrowed eyes. Then he turned and followed them into the trees. They ran, through the woods, feet pounding the damp ground, branches slapping at their cloaks. Behind them, the sound of hooves broke through the quiet, at least 2 riders moving fast. The forest offered cover, but not forever. They had only one advantage. They knew where they were going. The plan was simple. Follow the river east. Reach the main road before nightfall. Find the old courier station where Father Lambert had left a horse hidden for emergencies. From there, London was a day's ride away. But plans rarely held. By midday, the rain began. It came in sudden sheets, soaking them through, turning the forest path into thick, sucking mud. The river rose quickly, brown and wild. They pressed on, driven by fear more than hope now. The riders stayed close, sometimes too close. Once they heard a voice call out just behind the trees. Liesel slipped in the mud, and Johanna nearly lost her footing catching her. Finally, they saw the station, a crooked building half covered by ivy, hidden beside an old stone bridge. The door was still locked. Lambert found the key buried beneath a rock where he'd said it would be. Inside, the smell of hay and leather hit them hard. The horse was there, small, fast, ready. But only one. There's no time to find another, Lambert said. One of you takes it. The other two go north. Scatter them. Force them to choose. Johanna's heart clenched. I'm not leaving her. You have to, Liesel said quietly. You're the one they want. You have the ledger. But you survive, Liesel said firmly. That's the only way any of this matters. Father Lambert didn't argue. He saddled the horse and handed Johanna a wrapped cloth filled with food and a second copy of Thomas's notebook, one he had secretly transcribed. Don't stop, he told her. Not until you see the River Thames. Johanna looked at Liesel one last time. The girl gave her a shaky smile and whispered, You'll do what Thomas never could. And then she rode. The rain blurred the trees into gray streaks. The sound of hooves beat like war drums against the wet earth. She didn't look back. Every bend in the path could be the last before they caught her. But she rode harder, teeth gritted, heart hammering. She could hear them behind her now, closer, too close. Branches cracked, voices yelled. Someone fired a crossbow. The bolt missed her by inches. She ducked low, the ledger pressed to her chest. London was still a day away, and behind her, the lion was hunting. Johanna didn't stop riding until the moon hung high and pale in the sky, casting a faint silver glow across the drenched forest path. Her arms ached from gripping the reins. Her legs were sore from the saddle, and the horse was trembling beneath her, its breath heavy and labored. They had put a good stretch of land between themselves and the riders, but she knew it wasn't enough. Not with what she carried, not with who she was now. At the edge of a clearing, she slowed the horse and slipped off, her boots sinking into the soft, wet earth. A small stream ran nearby, and she let the horse drink while she crouched beside it, splashing her face with cold water. Every nerve in her body was alive with tension. Every breath felt stolen. She unwrapped the ledger again and looked down at the wet leather cover, stained darker by rain and time. So much weight in such a small book. Inside were the names of merchants, officers, and nobles, people who had sold out their own country in secret, trading loyalties like coins at market. And somewhere in the middle of it all, always watching, always circling, was Sir Harold, the man Thomas had feared most. Johanna sat back against a tree and closed her eyes, the sound of the stream rushing nearby. She thought about the brothel, about the girl she used to be, the one who didn't matter, who didn't speak unless spoken to, the one who had mastered the art of going unnoticed. Now, she was the center of something dangerous. A storm was forming, and she was standing in its eye. By dawn, the horse was rested enough to continue. The road to London narrowed into muddy lanes lined with crooked fences and scattered farms. She passed wagons headed west, their drivers bundled in cloaks, eyes wary of strangers. No one looked her way for long. That was a gift, and she used it. Just before midday, the gray towers of the city rose ahead, misty, looming, and full of secrets. London. She had only been here once before, years ago, too young to remember much. But now she saw it for what it was, a place of power and silence, where the weight of gold was heavier than justice, and where the truth, if you weren't careful, could be buried beneath stone. She made her way through the narrow alleys near the docks, avoiding guards and the crowded main roads. Her destination was a small print shop hidden behind an apothecary near Pudding Lane, a place Father Lambert had spoken of in hushed tones. The scribe, William Dane, worked there under false names, always moving, always listening. She found the building by the sign above the door. A black raven perched on an open scroll. Johanna knocked twice, then once again, just as Lambert had instructed. The door opened a crack. A man with ink-stained fingers and sharp eyes peered out. "Who sent you?" he asked. "Thomas," Johanna replied. "By way of Lambert." The door opened wider. "Come in." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ink and old paper. Presses lined the walls, and stacks of pamphlets were tied with string, ready to be hidden or distributed. William Dane looked older than she expected, mid-40s, hair streaked with gray, but his gaze was steady and unflinching. "You've come far," he said, motioning to a chair. "Sit. Tell me what you carry." Johanna sat slowly and pulled the ledger from her bag. She placed it on the table between them and opened to the page with Finch's signature. "This," she said quietly, "is a list of lies dressed as trade. Weapons moved in secret, soldiers betrayed, towns left unprotected. It's all here. Names, dates, payments." Dane leaned in, scanning the pages quickly. His eyes widened slightly at the crest of a lion and the seal of crossed swords. "This is damning," he murmured. "You understand what this means?" Johanna nodded. "They'll come for you too, once it's printed." "They already do," he said with a small smile. "But I've been waiting for something like this. Something real. Something no one can ignore." He stood and began pulling pages from the ledger, laying them across a large wooden board. "We'll print this in pieces," he said. "Disguise it among other stories. Spread it city to city. The truth doesn't need to scream. It needs to whisper in every ear." "But the wolf," Johanna said. "Sir Harold. He'll try to silence it before it reaches too far." "Then we make it impossible to silence," Dane replied. That night, as Dane's press clattered to life and the first pages of truth rolled out into the darkness, Johanna sat by the small window and watched the city breathe. She thought about Liesel, brave, still hiding in the woods. About Lambert, risking his life for a future he'd never see. About Thomas, whose voice she could still hear in quiet moments. She had become something else now. Not just a girl who survived, but a spark meant to catch. Below her, workers gathered the fresh pages, stacking them in baskets and preparing for dawn distribution. Above her, the city remained unaware. But not for long, because buried in those pages, written in the same ink used to sign orders and sell soldiers, was a name, a truth, a reckoning. And it was coming. By morning, the first wave of broadsheets had made its way through the winding alleys and busy marketplaces of London. They bore no headline, no author's name, just a single phrase across the top in bold ink. "The lion has lied." Beneath it, short passages drawn directly from the red ledger were printed in plain, factual language. No dramatic claims, no wild accusations, just names, dates, and numbers. Transactions that should not have existed. Shipments routed to empty ports. Soldiers reassigned without orders. Coin exchanged behind closed doors, all tied to Finch and the mysterious figure marked as SH. William Dane had been right. The power of truth wasn't in shouting. It was in the whisper that couldn't be unheard. Johanna watched from the upper floor of the print shop as vendors began folding the papers into baskets, slipping them into pockets, handing them off to children who would scatter them like breadcrumbs across the city. She felt the storm shifting, slow but sure. And for the first time in weeks, a sliver of hope wedged itself beneath the weight in her chest. But she also knew what came next. "They'll try to discredit it," Dane said quietly beside her. "They'll say it's forged, that it came from foreign hands or rebel hearts. And if that doesn't work," Johanna asked, "they'll try to erase the source. You." Johanna met his gaze. "Then I have to stay ahead of them." He handed her a fresh copy of the paper, the ink still faintly warm. "There's more in that ledger. We'll publish it in waves, one lie at a time." She nodded, then turned her eyes back to the street. That afternoon, the streets began to buzz with quiet tension. Men gathered in corners, speaking in hushed tones. The city watch was out in greater numbers, and by nightfall, 2 print shops had already been raided and shut down. Dane had expected it. His press was packed and moved to another location before midnight. Johanna helped. She knew now that she couldn't just pass off the ledger and disappear. She had to be a part of it. She had to see it through. And still, beneath the movement, the hiding, the constant planning, her thoughts kept circling back to Liesel. She hadn't heard anything. Not since they parted ways at the courier station. No messenger. No sign. That silence worried her more than all the guards and nobles combined. By the second night, the whispers had reached the edges of the royal court. William sent a trusted runner to eavesdrop near the chambers of the chancellor. He returned with word that the court was troubled, and the queen had demanded a review of the accusations. That meant it was working. That meant the truth had begun to rot the curtain they hid behind. But with that progress came risk. Finch would not sit quietly while his name was dragged through every street and tavern, and neither would Sir Harold. It was just after midnight when Dane's second press house was found and burnt. The blaze lit the eastern quarter with angry orange light, and the smell of scorched parchment drifted across the city. Johanna watched from a rooftop as the flames crackled high. 2 men stood near the fire, both cloaked in dark coats. One of them wore gloves. Finch. She recognized the sharp outline of his posture, the calculated way he stood, like a man controlling the game even while others did the burning. Dane joined her on the rooftop, face tight. That's the last press I had in the city. We'll find another, Johanna said, or build one. But even as she said it, she knew the window was closing. They were no longer one step ahead. They were being hunted with more urgency now. We need to change the way we fight, she said. Publishing isn't enough anymore. Dane looked at her, surprised. What do you mean? We need testimony. From someone inside. Someone who knows Harold's name. Someone who saw the orders being signed. Dane hesitated. That's dangerous. Johanna didn't flinch, so is doing nothing. She left London before dawn, dressed as a merchant's assistant and carrying nothing but the ledger, a knife, and a name. Liesel. She would find her, and together, they would find someone who had seen Sir Harold with his own hands on the strings. It was nearly a week before Johanna found the first trail again. Footprints in the forest near the courier station, a broken reed along a creek, a scarf Liesel had once worn, caught in a bramble bush. She followed the trail north, her boots soaked, her cloak ragged, but her will sharpened by the days in London. Somewhere out there, Liesel was either hiding or captured. On the 6th day, she found her. Liesel was alive, but barely. Hidden in a hayloft in an abandoned barn, her leg twisted from a fall, her lips cracked from thirst. She had escaped the riders, but not without cost. Her eyes widened when Johanna appeared, disbelief washing over her features. You came back, Liesel whispered. Of course I did, Johanna said, her throat tight. She wrapped lies. Johanna wrapped Liesel in her cloak and helped her drink slowly from the leather pouch at her side. Liesel's hands trembled, but she clung to Johanna like a drowning soul finding shore. For a long while, neither of them spoke. There were no words that could capture what they had survived or what still hunted them. When Liesel could finally breathe without pain, Johanna checked her injured leg. It was swollen and dark around the ankle, but not broken. Twisted, maybe torn. She'd be able to move, but not fast. Not far. We'll rest here tonight, Johanna said quietly. And by morning, I'll find a cart. Maybe a farmer nearby. Someone who can be paid in silence. Liesel nodded weakly. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke again. Did it work? The printing. Johanna smiled faintly. It started. William got the first wave out. Enough to stir the nobles. But they're hunting us harder now. Finch burned down the second press. They're afraid. Good, Liesel whispered. Johanna looked at her carefully. I need you. Not just to stay alive, but to help finish what we started. Liesel's brow furrowed. There's a name in the ledger, Johanna continued. S.H. Sir Harold. We need someone who saw him giving orders. Someone who worked close enough to know it wasn't just ink on paper. You were near him once. At the dye house. Remember? Liesel closed her eyes. The barn creaked softly around them, wind tugging at the loose wood. He came with another man. Not Finch, Older, pale hair, wore a scar on his cheek. Johanna's pulse quickened. Did they speak? Only once, Liesel said. The man with the scar said, His Majesty would never know. Then Harold said, That's the idea. Johanna's breath caught. You heard that? Liesel nodded. Clear as church bells. Johanna reached into her bag and pulled out a scrap of parchment and charcoal. She held it out. I need you to write it. In your hand. Exactly as you remember it. Liesel hesitated. They'll kill me for this. They'll kill you for less, Johanna said gently. But this might be what finally brings them down. Liesel took the charcoal. Her hand shook, but the words came, slow and steady, until the line was written plainly across the parchment. Asterisk, that's the idea. S.H. Asterisk. The sun rose gray and cold over the barn the next morning. Johanna helped Liesel to her feet and guided her slowly out into the woods, where they found a quiet farmhouse with an old man and his blind dog. He didn't ask names. When Johanna gave him 3 silver coins and asked for his cart and mule, he only nodded once and began readying the harness. They rode back toward London at a crawling pace, hidden beneath crates of hay and sacks of grain. It was dangerous, but it was their only way back in without being seen. By the time they reached the city gates, William Dane was waiting. He had moved the printing to a cellar beneath a bakery, deep, damp, but impossible to find without knowing exactly where to look. He embraced Johanna when he saw her, and when he saw Liesel, his eyes filled with a rare flash of emotion. She made it, he murmured. She did more than that, Johanna replied, handing him the parchment. This is the first voice they can erase. Dane read the line. Then again, his eyes widened slightly. It's not just what was done. It's who they knew, what they planned. Johanna nodded. We print this next. Dane looked at them both. Then you understand, you'll never be safe again. We weren't safe before, Liesel whispered. That night, a new broadsheet began its quiet journey across the city. It bore the title, Voices in the Dust. And beneath it, for the first time, came the truth, not from records or ledgers, but from the mouths of those who had survived it, witnessed it, dared to remember. And somewhere in a manor house, cloaked in firelight, Sir Harold held the first copy in his gloved hands and realized he was no longer ahead. He was cornered, and the world was finally listening. Sir Harold stood in the center of his private chamber, his face still as stone, the flickering candlelight painting strange shapes across the page he held. The broadsheet crackled faintly in his gloved fingers. He read the line again. Asterisk, that's the idea. S.H. Asterisk. And something in his jaw tightened. He had known the ledger might resurface. He had anticipated the whispers, the accusations. But he had not expected this. Not the words spoken in that specific room. Not a voice that was supposed to be silenced. He folded the paper slowly and turned to the man in the corner of the room, a broad-shouldered guard with a faded red sash across his chest. Find the girl, Sir Harold said, his voice calm. She's not a ghost. And ghosts don't write things they shouldn't know. The guard hesitated. We've searched every quarter, every cellar. Then search beneath them, Harold replied. And start with the printmaster. The guard bowed and left without another word. Harold stood there for a moment longer, then reached for a small box hidden behind the drapery near the hearth. Inside it was a sealed envelope, the wax unbroken, marked with a single sigil, a black crown. He hadn't wanted to use it. It was meant for something else, a different kind of disaster. But this threat, this spread of truth in the hands of commoners, it was unraveling faster than he'd expected. He tucked the envelope into his coat and left the manor before dawn. Back in the city, Johanna and Liesel had no idea the storm had shifted again. They were already preparing for the next phase, smuggling the full contents of the Red Ledger to allies outside London. Dane was making arrangements to deliver copies to sympathetic figures in York and Canterbury, and they had quietly enlisted 2 former city scribes to continue transcribing every line. The voices of the past, recorded in silence, were about to echo far louder than any of them imagined. But then something strange happened. By the 3rd morning, not a single broadsheet vendor was at the usual market corner. The boy who used to run with stacks of papers at sunrise never arrived. The woman who owned the shop near Dane's hideout had disappeared. No warnings. No trace. Johanna noticed first. "Something's wrong," she said, gripping the edge of the cellar door. Dane was already one step ahead. He had hidden 3 emergency packs in case they needed to vanish, and by nightfall, he was moving them through the back alleys of Blackfriars, toward a safe house near the old ruins. But the streets were different now. Too quiet. The tension that had once buzzed softly in the background had turned heavy, dangerous, watchful. That night, a knock came at the safe house door. 2 short, 1 long, the signal Father Lambert had always used. Johanna opened it quickly, expecting the old priest. But it wasn't him. It was a boy, barely 12, out of breath, his cheeks streaked with soot. "They got him," he whispered. "The priest." Johanna's knees nearly buckled. "What?" "They took him right after dusk. At the chapel. No guards. Just men. Quiet men. Dressed like dockhands. I heard one say, 'Don't bruise the voice too much.'" Dane swore under his breath. Liesel stood frozen, her face pale. No one said what they were all thinking. The voice in the dust had been heard, and now they were erasing it. But it wasn't just Lambert. Over the next 2 days, more news filtered in. Quiet arrests. Silent disappearances. The scribe who had written the line under Liesel's testimony vanished from his home. A girl who had once worked at the dye house and promised to testify never showed up to the meeting place. One by one, the threads were being cut. Cleanly. Precisely. And then the second twist came, cutting deeper than any of them had expected. William Dane didn't return from his errand on the 3rd night. He had gone to deliver a message to a trusted courier, someone they had used before. But he never came back. By morning, Johanna knew. The front page of the day's official paper, a Crown-sanctioned publication that rarely printed names, listed a single line. "A traitor's ink dries faster than his blood. The truth lies only with the Crown." They didn't even use his name. Johanna read the line in silence, the world spinning around her. Liesel sat beside her, unmoving, her eyes red from hours of holding back tears. "They killed him," she said, "and they want us to know they did." Johanna stared at the page. "They're baiting us, trying to force our hand. But what do we do now?" Liesel asked, her voice cracking. "We have the ledger, but no one to print it. No one left to protect it. We go louder," Johanna said after a long pause. "We make it public, not just on paper. We stand where they can't silence us, where they have to listen." "You mean?" "The square," Johanna said. "Outside Parliament. At the hour of judgment. We take the ledger and speak the names." Liesel stared at her. "That's suicide." "Maybe," Johanna said, "but it's the only way to finish what Dane started." The stakes were no longer just about a ledger or a handful of broadsheets. The conflict had escalated. Now it was a battle for memory, for the right to speak, to name, to resist. And if they were to die, then the truth would die screaming. They had 1 day left to prepare. Because once Johanna stood in that square, with a red leather book in her hands, nothing would be the same again. The morning of the planned speech arrived beneath a heavy sky. The clouds hung low over London like a curtain waiting to fall. Johanna stood at the window of the crumbling safe house, watching as the streets below came alive. Carriages creaking by, vendors shouting half-hearted greetings, guards marching in small patrols. From this distance, the city looked normal. But she knew better. She tightened the strap across her chest, where the red ledger lay hidden beneath her cloak. Every page inside was now etched in her mind. Every name, every transaction, every betrayal. It was no longer just evidence. It had become a part of her. The city had tried to erase people like her for centuries, with silence, with shame, with fear. But today, that silence would break. Liesel was already dressed, her limp less visible now, but still painful. She hadn't argued when Johanna insisted she stay behind. They both knew the danger. Johanna would be the face today. Liesel's part, her testimony, had already been printed and whispered through hidden alleys. She had done enough. Now, Johanna would carry the rest. Before leaving, Johanna handed Liesel a folded piece of parchment. "If I don't come back," she said softly, "give this to the courier near St. George's." He'll know where to take it. Liesel nodded, silent but strong, her eyes never leaving Johannes. The walk to Parliament Square was long and slow. Johanna took back alleys, weaving through market stalls and between delivery carts. She kept her hood low, her hands tucked beneath her cloak. No guard stopped her. No one looked twice, but she knew they were watching. By the time she reached the edge of the square, the first group of citizens had already gathered, dozens of them, murmuring to one another, glancing nervously at the steps of Parliament. Word had spread, just as Dane had predicted. The phrase, "the lion has lied," had become a quiet chant in taverns, a scratch on walls, a note passed in bread baskets. People were starting to believe the rumors were more than just stories. They had come looking for truth. Johanna stepped forward and climbed the stone platform near the statue of the old king. Her heart pounded, but she kept her face steady. She reached into her cloak and pulled the ledger free, holding it high for all to see. At first, the crowd was still. Then a man near the front pointed. "That's it," he whispered. "The book." Johanna opened it slowly and began to speak, not shouting, not pleading, just telling the story. "This book," she said, "contains the names of those who sold our safety, who traded soldiers for gold, who turned from honor in favor of silence. They sent weapons to enemies and left our towns unguarded. They bought power with blood." She turned a page. "This entry," she said, holding it up, "shows a shipment of arms rerouted from Bristol to a pirate port in the north. Signed by Lord Finch." The crowd stirred. A few people gasped. "Here," she continued, pointing again, "money exchanged to delay reinforcements to the southern coast. That delay cost 24 lives. And it was done under orders, signed with the seal of Sir Harold of Kent." Now there were whispers. Faces darkened. People began pushing closer. Johanna looked out over them, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "They told us it was for the good of the kingdom, but it was for gold, for silence, and for power." A sharp cry broke through the crowd. Someone had seen them, guards, moving in from the east, pushing through the onlookers with steel glinting at their sides. Johanna didn't flinch. She turned another page. "This one," she said loudly, "proves the crown was lied to, that the men trusted by the highest offices acted without approval. This one has a note beside it, a witness, and that witness is alive." A stone flew from the edge of the crowd, hitting the pavement near the guards. The tension snapped like a bowstring. People surged forward, not in violence, but in refusal. They stood between Johanna and the guards, blocking the path. More guards appeared from the west. Orders were shouted. The crowd wasn't moving. And in the middle of it, Johanna stood with the book still open, her voice rising. "They want to silence us because the truth is heavier than their gold. Because they fear what happens when we all start to speak." A horn sounded. The crowd panicked. Guard began pushing harder, grabbing those in the front row. But people held. Some shouted. Others lifted their fists. And Johanna didn't stop. She turned the final page she would read and said the line they could never take back. "A witness heard Sir Harold say, asterisk, His Majesty would never know. Asterisk, and the answer was asterisk, that's the idea. Asterisk." The crowd roared. Someone pulled Johanna down, just as a guard's blade slashed the air where her head had been. A hand grabbed her, dragging her back through the masses. An old market boy she had once paid for directions. He led her through a side street, down into a cellar filled with barrels and the smell of vinegar. "You can't stay," he said. "They'll come here next." Johanna looked up at him, her breath coming hard. "Did they see the book?" "Everyone did," he said. "They saw you." She tightened her grip on the ledger, still clutched her chest. "They'll never put it back in the dark," she whispered. And above them, in the smoke-filled air of the square, someone shouted it again. "The lion has lied." It echoed. It caught. It spread. And across the city, the real battle had just begun. Johanna didn't stop running until the sky turned gray with ash and dust, and the sound of shouting faded behind her. She gripped the red ledger so tightly it left marks across her skin, but it didn't matter. The words inside were no longer just secrets. They were sparks. And now the city had caught fire. Every block, every alley, Every market stall hummed with the same question. If the lion had lied, what else had they hidden? She ducked into another cellar, this one tucked behind a bakery on Milk Street. There, Liesel waited, pacing nervously, a battered satchel at her feet. When Johanna burst in, she rushed forward, nearly toppling her. "You did it," Liesel whispered, tears in her eyes. "I heard the square. I heard them shouting your name." Johanna shook her head, breathless. "Not my name. The truth's. That's what matters now." Outside, bells were ringing, church bells, warning bells. One of the towers had been set ablaze by a group of angry citizens who had seen the guards beat an old man for carrying one of Dane's broadsheets. It was spreading. What started as whispers had turned into voices, and those voices were no longer afraid. But in the darkness, deep in the folds of the city's power, Sir Harold was moving. He hadn't fled like Finch had. The Lord had vanished the moment the crowd turned. But Harold was methodical. He stayed in his manor, surrounded by a loyal guard and the quiet confidence of a man who had always won. Until tonight, when Johanna and Liesel arrived at the outer walls of his estate, they expected to see soldiers. Instead, they found only silence. The front gate was open, swinging gently in the wind. The torch by the door was snuffed. Inside, the main hall was empty, save for a few overturned chairs and a single servant girl huddled near the fireplace, her eyes wide with fear. "They're gone," she whispered when Johanna approached. "All of them." He dismissed the guards at sundown. "Why?" Liesel asked. The girl shook her head. He said it was finished, that the ledger had already decided his fate. Johanna felt her stomach twist. "Where is he?" "In the study." They found him seated by the fire, a decanter half empty beside him, the black envelope from the box now torn open on his desk. When Johanna stepped into the room, he didn't rise. He simply looked up, his expression calm, almost curious. "You got what you wanted," he said softly. The people turned. "No," Johanna said. They woke up. "There's a difference." Harold gave a faint, tired smile. "You think this will end everything? This kingdom has seen worse than me. It forgets. It always forgets." Johanna pulled the ledger from her cloak and dropped it on his desk. "Not this time. This time, we wrote it down." He studied the book for a long moment, then ran a hand down his face. "And what now, girl? You want me dragged through the streets? Let them spit and cheer while I'm hanged at dawn." "I want you held accountable," she said. "Not just for the lies. For the people you hurt. The ones no one ever writes about." Liesel stepped forward, voice shaking. "Like the girl at the dye house. Like the priest. Like the ones who trusted you." Harold finally stood. He looked older now, more hollow. "There are bigger men still walking free. I was a servant of the crown." "No," Johanna said. "You were a servant of yourself." He looked at her for a long time. Then he walked toward the wall and pulled back a curtain. Behind it was a passage, narrow, winding into the stone. "I sent the last letter an hour ago," he said. "To the council. I confessed everything." Johanna's breath caught. "Why?" Harold turned back. "Because the war was never going to be won by blood. You proved that. You turned ink and silence into fire. So maybe the fire should burn clean." She didn't follow him into the passage. She didn't need to. By morning, news spread that Sir Harold had disappeared. Some said he fled to the coast. Others claimed he took his own life in the catacombs beneath the manor. No body was found. No guards remained. Just his signed confession, delivered by a royal courier, confirming the ledger's truths. The crown was silent at first. But as more protests grew, as more papers were printed, they could no longer look away. An inquiry was called. Names were summoned. And for the first time in decades, the people watched as noble blood was held to account. Johanna didn't return to the brothel. She didn't have to. She and Liesel stayed in the city for a few weeks, working with others who had stepped forward, former scribes, silenced widows, even a few quiet allies in Parliament. Together, they ensured that the truth didn't just survive, it lived. But the twist came 1 month later, when Liesel brought her a sealed note wrapped in blue ribbon. It came from the coast, she said. Inside was a single line, scrawled in tight, elegant handwriting. Asterisk, the lion sleeps, but the cubs grow bold. Asterisk, it was signed only F. Johanna stared at the paper, her heart skipping. Finch, he was alive, and somewhere he was watching. It wasn't over, but neither was she. Johanna sat on the balcony of the small flat above the candlemaker's shop, staring out over the rooftops of London as the note trembled in her hands. The sky was a fading blue-gray, and the last of the chimneys were still puffing gentle streams of smoke into the air. Liesel was asleep behind her, curled beneath a patchwork blanket, the soft rhythm of her breathing the only sound in the quiet. The word from the note burned in Johanna's mind. Asterisk, the lion sleeps, but the cubs grow bold. Asterisk, it was a message, yes, but also a warning. Finch wasn't just alive. He was regrouping, watching, waiting, and worse still, he still believed there were others like Harold, hidden, protected, waiting for the smoke to clear so they could rise again. Johanna folded the note carefully and tucked it into her satchel. She didn't want to alarm Liesel yet, not until she knew what they were up against. But a knot had already formed in her stomach. Something was coming, and this time it would be louder, more dangerous, more desperate. The next morning, she visited the Scribes Guild. Most of the members were new, replacements for the ones who had disappeared or defected during the peak of the unrest. The guild was still cautious, but Johanna's name now carried weight. When she asked for space to speak to the leaders, she was granted it without question. "I don't ask for another printing press," she told them. "I ask for a network. Quiet hands. Trusted messengers. If Finch is still out there, then others are too. We need to trace them before they regroup, before they bury the truth under new lies." The head scribe, a stooped man named Elias, rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You want to build an intelligence ring?" "I want to build a memory," Johanna said, "so we don't forget again." He agreed, and by the end of the week, letters were quietly dispatched to towns and ports where whispers of rebellion and corruption still lingered. Johanna worked late into each night, going over the ledger again and again, circling names she hadn't focused on before, names connected to Harold and Finch by the thinnest of lines. Suppliers, couriers, mid-level commanders who had conveniently vanished after the scandal broke. One name stood out: Ambrose Cutter, a merchant listed only once, connected to a shipment of uniforms that never reached the southern border. His signature was small and nearly forgotten, but Dane had underlined it before he died. That was enough for Johanna. She and Liesel packed light and traveled to Dover, where Ambrose had last been seen. The town was quiet, colder than London, and surrounded by mist and fishermen who rarely spoke. It took 2 days before a stable boy finally pointed them toward a man who matched the description: balding, quick-tempered, always asking too many questions at the docks. They found him living in the back of Shutter Granary. At first, he tried to slam the door in their faces. Then he saw the ledger Johanna held and stopped cold. "I don't know anything," he stammered. "You don't have to know much," Johanna said softly. "Just enough." Cutter hesitated, sweat forming on his brow. "They'll kill me." "They try to kill us too," Liesel said. "But we're still here." Something in Cutter's eyes shifted. Maybe it was fear, maybe guilt, but he let them in. Inside, the granary was cold and damp, filled with crates covered in mildew and cobwebs. He poured them each a mug of water and sat on a broken crate, fidgeting. "I moved goods for them," he said after a long silence. "Didn't know who for at first, but then I saw the markings. The seal. Same one Finch wore. Same one Sir Harold had stamped on the barrels. They never gave full names. But there were more." "How many more?" Johanna asked. "3 I remember," he said. "Lady Marrow from Eastgate, Lord Bellamy from the southern coast, and someone called the Jackal. I never saw his face, only heard the name, always whispered." Johanna looked at Liesel, heart pounding. This was the second plot twisting itself into their path, one that stretched far beyond Harold and Finch, one with deeper roots, older scars. "You wrote it down?" Johanna asked. Cutter nodded. "Out of fear. I kept a list. Hidden. It's under the floor." They found it wrapped in wax cloth, scrawled in panicked handwriting. Dozens of names. Some crossed out, some underlined, all connected to the same quiet betrayal. When they returned to London, the city was already stirring again. New laws were being proposed. The royal court was reshuffling, and the people, though no longer shouting in the streets, were still watching. Johanna knew now that exposing Harold had been only the first layer. The lion might have fallen, but the pride remained. Hidden in noble homes, dressed in silk, speaking in codes, she gathered the list, the ledger, and a new group of allies, scribes, former soldiers, even a few guards who had once turned a blind eye but now wanted to set things right. And for the second time, Johanna prepared to speak, not in a square, not with a shout, but with a series of soft, unstoppable truths. Letters went out, names published one by one. The lion had lied, but now the lion's den was wide open, and its shadows were beginning to shrink. By the time the last of the names were published, the city had changed. Not all at once, not in a way anyone could point to on a map or in a decree, but something had shifted in the hearts of the people. It was in the way they greeted each other, a little more openly, in the way they questioned what had once gone unquestioned. The red ledger was no longer a secret, no longer a weapon hidden in the shadows. It had become a mirror showing London, and the entire kingdom, what had always been there but had long been ignored. Johanna stood on the steps of the candle shop, watching a pair of boys chase each other through the cobblestone street. One of them had a scrap of old parchment folded like a sword, shouting about truth and lions. She smiled faintly. The broadsheets had turned into ballads, the names into fables. Children, who just months before had only known silence and fear, now sang verses about the girl with the book and the shadow merchant in the mist. It wasn't a full story, but it was enough. Enough to remember. Liesel joined her outside, her ankles still stiff but healing. She held a cup of tea and wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "You think they'll come back?" she asked softly. "Some of them never left," Johanna said. "But they're quieter now, watching, not ruling." Finch had never been found. Rumors said he had boarded a ship to the Eastern Territories. Others claimed he was hiding under a false name in the hills of the north. But Johanna no longer needed to chase him. His power had come from silence, from the shadows he moved in. Now that the truth lived in daylight, there was nowhere left for men like him to hide for long. Lady Marrow and Lord Bellamy were formally stripped of their titles. One confessed outright, the other vanished before trial. The Jackal, whoever he had been, remained a mystery, his name lingering like smoke but with no face attached. Johanna had decided to stop looking. Some ghosts weren't meant to be hunted, not because they weren't real, but because the truth they served had already been exposed. William Dane was honored quietly by the Scribes Guild. No statue, no parade, but his writings were preserved, his name etched into the binding of every new record book issued in the city. Let ink weigh more than gold, it read just beneath his name. It was enough. It was everything he'd stood for. Johanna and Liesel chose not to return to the brothel. That life was behind them, not forgotten, but folded into their story like any other chapter. They stayed in the city for a while longer, helping teach young girls to read, helping organize stories that needed telling, stories that might have been ignored if not for what they had started. When the time felt right, they left the city together, walking east past the riverside and the farmlands, to a village where the fields grew quiet and wide, and the wind didn't carry whispers of fear. There, Johanna began to write, not on parchment for broadsheets, but in a leather-bound journal Dane had given her long ago. She wrote down everything, not just the names and dates, but the faces, the moments, the nights filled with doubt, and the mornings that broke with a little more light. She wrote about how change had come not from battles, but from persistence, from ink, from women who had once been taught to stay silent. Sometimes, travelers would visit the village and bring stories with them, about how the crown had passed new reforms, how Parliament was now required to keep public records, how the people had started gathering on the first of every month to read the names from the ledger aloud. Each time, Johanna would smile and say nothing. She didn't need the credit. She only needed to know it mattered. One day, years later, a little girl approached her by the well. She had tangled hair and curious eyes, and asked if the old red book in Johanna's hands was the one from the stories. Johanna looked down at the faded leather cover, now worn smooth with time and use. "Yes," she said softly. But the book was only part of it. The girl leaned in. What was the other part? Johanna thought for a long moment. Then she closed the book gently and handed it to the girl. Courage, she said, and memory. Without both, words mean nothing. The girl nodded like she understood, even if she didn't yet. She would one day. As the seasons passed, the story of the lion and the ledger continued to live on. It was taught quietly in small homes, passed down through mothers and daughters, brothers and uncles. Not as a fairy tale, but as a reminder that power unchecked will always bend towards silence, and that even those with no name, no title, no wealth can shake the walls of the highest towers if they speak together, clearly and without fear. Johanna and Liesel spent their days in peace. They grew herbs, taught children, and watched the sun rise without having to wonder who was listening behind the door. They didn't need grand endings or medals or parades. Their victory was in every unafraid voice, every page printed freely, every child who knew their name meant something. And on quiet nights, when the wind brushed through the trees and the stars hung heavy overhead, Johanna would sometimes open the old ledger again. Not because she needed to remember, but because she wanted to never forget. Because history, when told with honesty, never truly sleeps. And neither do the ones who dared to write it.